Hi, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Huber, joined today by the usual suspects, Logan, Whitmer, and John Doyle. Today is episode number 126. On today's episode, we will be discussing lumber storage and the wood stashes that we want or don't want in our shops. Hope you enjoy today's episode. So there you go. Oh, I wanted to say thanks to everybody who commented on the last week's podcast announcing the relaunch of ShopNotes. It's nice to see that folk remembered ShopNotes and still have a lot of love for it, and the enthusiasm as we have to get this thing back into publication.
What the crap? We're relaunching ShopNotes?
Surprise!
Dang it!
Surprise!
I feel like you didn't listen to the podcast last week.
I didn't. You're
Right.
right. Guilty. Ugh. Yeah.
All right. So here's the question for today. And I feel like it is in my workshop, so I'm going to assume that it's the case in a lot of people's workshop, is that when you have a small space, you intentionally or unintentionally leave out certain categories of something.
Okay.
So, for example, in my shop, I have a lumber rack, really nice one, was featured in ShopNotes magazine, oddly enough. And it does a great job for kind of project parts, even has some tool storage and places for smaller, shorter pieces. I'll put a link to that plan on the show notes page. But it doesn't have anything for plywood storage. Therefore, my shop doesn't have plywood storage.
Okay.
And it's kind of haunted me because I'll have, most of the time if I'm bringing plywood in, it's for a specific project and it gets sliced and diced into project pieces. But you're always going to have those like half to less size plywood panels that aren't humongous, but they don't fit in a lumber rack. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Could you cut them into strips that do fit on your lumber rack and then glue them?
Just glue them
together?
up when I need to. Right.
Just, yeah, when you need them. It's just like lumber. Problem solved. Episode over.
I'm going to write that one down.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So where I was going with that is because even though my lumber rack is really nice and holds a lot more than I think it does, there isn't a ton of space in there for kind of the serendipity wood that one might find. And I'm looking at Logan Whitmer at this point as a sawyer who I'm sure has far more material than he wants right now.
We call it inventory, Phil. In the biz.
In the biz.
It's money in the bank is what it is. I'm saving it for a rainy day. I'm saving it for my next big tool purchase that I need to get some cash for.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't store plywood. Like
that, and that's fair. But it's like when you do use plywood, what do you do with the leftover pieces? Are you fine with just chucking everything X size and smaller?
Yeah, I'm a like 6 inches and under is gone.
Yeah. What do you do with like if you have a half a sheet left over?
I don't use plywood. I guess I don't know because I don't really use plywood that much in my shop. I mean, if I okay, no, hold on. Let me rephrase this. If I use plywood in a project, I do it in the shop office, and then I put it in our plywood rack. And that's where it stays until somebody uses it. I donate it to the greater good. No, so I do have...
Ply it forward.
I ply it forward, that's right. I do have maybe a sheet of, like a half sheet of MDF and a half sheet of pegboard that is stored in my garage right now. I basically stand it up against the wall, and then it goes behind my lumber. So it's like right now I got stacks of walnut and oak and sycamore leaning up against my wall, but behind those is my plywood. Is it a good solution? No, but you never ask for good solutions. To be honest with you, I think the best plywood holder. I have one of the lumber carts from Woodsmith, I think.
Yeah,
I don't think it was a ShopNotes one. I'm pretty sure it was a Woodsmith one. And it has some plywood storage in it. I just don't like any plywood storage I've ever seen designed, except for I like the one we have in the shop. The plywood rack. Now, Not everybody has space for that because it requires a 4-foot depth and 8 feet tall, and then they go in like a bookshelf, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the
which
best
it's really
option.
handy.
It is, and I think that's the best option if you have the space for it. So my plan right now, I use for lumber storage, I use like the Bora lumber racks. I've used like the ones you buy from Menards in the past, where it just has the upright standards and they have the clip in type things, and those are fine. But I think in once my new shop's up and we are, I have everything in there, I think I want to do some form of permanent lumber storage that I will try to incorporate a plywood sheet good holder like we have. It doesn't have to be wide. I don't hold a ton of, inventory of plywood, but for the occasional 2 or 3 sheets, I might make it 6 inches wide to hold, up to 5 or 6 sheets. And that's it. I don't usually like to have a bunch of plywood. I try to buy what I need for a project and then scrap the rest. I mean, I will hold on to. I will say I hold on to small parts. I'm looking at my lumber rack that's on the opposite side of the shop that I'm not going to show you because the shop is a nightmare. I do keep some smaller parts, mainly for like sacrificial miter gauge fences, stuff like that.
Right.
Or jigs, like something like just being able to screw a base plate onto a router, just a 1/2-inch piece of plywood that I had scrap on. But other than that, I try not to hold on to scrap lumber, and I put plywood in that category.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, because the one we have in the shop, if we loaded it up, we could probably put easy 40 plus sheets in there.
Oh yeah. Like right now, half of it has veneer and melamine and rolls of or sheets of copper in it. Just like goofy stuff. But yeah, if we just put straight up plywood in there, oh man, you load it up, have a truck full. I don't know if I'm guessing that was just a like shop guys decided to slap it together and put it in.
No, that was planned that way because we wanted to have there's that large entry door to the shop on that side, and the opposite wall has all of our board storage.
Yeah.
Well, plus it's the turning corner now too, but it used to be all board storage.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a very significant lumber storage area that accommodated not only long boards and full sheets of plywood, but smaller spaces for shorter but useful offcuts of solid wood. And then like there's the two bins, I guess like 4 bays kind of the offcut plywood panels,
Yeah. I guess what I was getting at, that was never like a plan though.
Oh no, it wasn't a plan. But
yeah, that's what I mean. Because it has a nice
Ted drew that up, and
it has a nice like roller system. not really a roller system, but there's like PVC on the bottom edge of it. So when you get a sheet halfway in, it will kind of teeter-totter and you can roll it in the rest of the way, which is really nice. And I like that.
Yep. That part is nice.
I mean, I'm sure, and I feel like I've seen these, and I know you guys could probably verify this. We've got a lot of reader tips on sheet goods storage, like hang it from the ceiling, or here's how I use my canoe dolly puller upper to hang my plywood sheets above my head. It's like, oh, cool.
Yeah.
Hope you don't die.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Now, would you guys be afraid to, I ask this because this is a great product idea, store your sheet goods outside in like a plastic sleeve?
A plywood envelope?
Yes, a plastic plywood envelope.
I think it would get
kind of
wavy.
reminds me of those big tube worm things that replace silos, where they have.
That's right. That's exactly. Yes,
it's just the white long plastic of.
That's exactly what it is.
Silage or round bales of hay or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be worried.
Okay.
I would probably be willing to try it, but know for sure that it would probably get a hole in it from some rock chucked by a mower or a kid, or chewed up by squirrels or chipmunks or something like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I asked that because when I was down at David Marcus's place a couple of weeks ago, well, a couple months ago now, he had a lot of lumber stored outside. Not necessarily lumber, but like turning blanks. Like we'd be walking around his backyard, and he has like an acre. He's like, yeah, and he whips off the tarp, and he's like, these are all Clara walnut burls, and there's like mounds of them. And some of the stuff was like, I don't think he had any sheet goods outside, but some of the stuff's like, man, I would not stick the stuff outside. But then I started thinking, my lumber's all outside, stuff that's not kiln dried. It's all stacked outside. Doesn't really hurt it. I have space under my deck that I could technically probably skin the underside of the deck so it would never get water under the deck, and I could put lumber under there. And I thought about storing sheet goods out there, knowing that it wouldn't get wet. It would be out through the humidity though, which is not a good thing necessarily. Right. So. But just in time inventory, man, that's what you need. Just in time plywood parts.
Goes in one door and out the other.
That's right.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of people that are, as woodworkers, that's kind of their wood philosophy, is that they only get the wood that they need for whatever projects they're currently working on, and then are pretty ruthless about scraps and short pieces and stuff like that. And I get that. But then I feel like and I'm kind of leaning this way, is, being able to take advantage of having some kind of a lumber stash a little bit. That you find X number of boards through a network of people or something like that, and you don't really have a specific use for it at the time, or it's a far off project, but like, hey, when am I ever going to have the opportunity to have half a tree of a white fir? And then where do you put that, and how? So I guess part of my question then is, if you were to have a long-term lumber hoard, kind of dragon style, what are some options for storing it long term? Where it doesn't have to be in your shop acclimating yet.
Yep.
But you found a too good to pass up deal.
Sounds like there needs to be like a lumber banking system out there. Can we do that?
That would be something to find out, like how many woodworkers have a self-storage unit that is basically a wood vault.
I mean, that's where I initially went, like thinking to, well, yeah, thinking to when I was in my old house and I didn't have, the space I have here. I just didn't let my wife park in the garage. I just had sawhorses that had a lot of lumber stacked on it.
Mm-hmm.
Not a great option, and I don't suggest it. But I think, like, I did have. Well, I guess it's when we were looking at moving out of this house, so I moved a lot of my lumber out of the garage. I did get a storage unit and stored it in there. It sucks to move it in and out, especially in Iowa when it's really hot. You basically send everything through a kiln cycle when you do that.
Right.
It was interesting because I listened to I like listening to Shannon Rogers, Renaissance Woodworker. I like to listen to his podcast, the Lumber Industry Update.
Yeah.
And he had a gentleman on there that's name is Tommaso something. But this guy is like a wood hoarder, basically. But like he likes to buy, batches of lumber from, estate sales, stuff like that. Grandpa had this walnut tree sawn, and it's been kind of sitting in the barn for years, and now the family's selling off everything, and he buys it at pennies on the dollar, basically. So he said something about how he thinks he has probably close to 40,000 board feet just stashed.
Whoa.
And most of it, if I remember right off this podcast, it's a couple weeks since I listened to it, but most of it, if I remember correctly, was like stored at friends' houses. So like, I have a friend that, and if I remember right, this guy might be in like the Pennsylvania, Virginia area, somewhere around there. I could be completely wrong on that. But like, he had friends that had like barns and they weren't necessarily using them. It's like, oh, hey, there's always a hayloft in a barn and the floor might be gone, but you got rafters, and rafters are a perfect place to store boards. And I think that's a valid option if you have an attic that's not getting used. You're introducing your lumber to depending on your climate, a really strenuous environment on it, between freezing cold, really hot and humid. Technically it should be fine, as long as you acclimate it once it comes back into your house. Don't put wet stuff up there either, or else you might be kind of percolating mold in your attic, or
right.
Potentially you case harden your lumber if it goes into the attic while it's wet and the outside gets super dried. But I think that's an option too. Like, do you want to be carrying boards up in your attic? I don't know, but maybe that's an option.
Yeah. Kind of depends on access.
It does.
What's your attic access?
Yeah.
Or if your garage has an attic space or space above it, I guess.
Yeah. I know Dana Myers, our former shop craftsman, I've cut quite a bit of lumber for him, and he doesn't have a ton of space, but he stores it under their 4-season porch. So his 4-season porch is enclosed, and then I think there's, if I remember right, there's like lattice work around it, but he has like a double door gate he can open up and crawl under there, and that's where all his lumber is stored. I gave him some really, really nice, I'm not bitter about this at all, if you can't tell. Gave him some really nice walnut 2 or 3 years ago. He still hasn't used it. It's under there. So
let's go get it back.
Yeah, I should. Knock on his door.
So before you had your sawmill, would you have considered storing boards outside? If you didn't have space for it inside somewhere?
Yes. Depends on what the species is and where it was at, and if I knew it was dry or not. The problem today ends up being more from the amount of people in the sawing industry. If you don't know if that board is dry, like you can feel a board and think it's dry, but it's not.
Yeah.
So if you don't know how that board was dried and it is wet and you're storing it outside under tarps, you're asking for a lot of mold. So
Sure.
like, so I guess what I'm getting at is if I knew where it came from and I knew for a fact that it was dry, then yes, I have no problems doing that, and I did do that. About 8 years ago or so, I bought a big batch of walnut from a guy up in LaPorte City, which is by Waterloo in Iowa. If anybody's, I know we have listeners from Iowa. But anyways, he had it sawn a number of years prior, and it was shorter stuff. It was like 6 foot stock, and it had been. I think he had it cut like 20 years ago. This guy was definitely a wood hoarder, and when I got it home, I did stack it outside and I stacked it under tarps because I knew it was dry. And actually, that's how the guy had it stored as well. He had it stored on a pallet in his backyard under tarps. That was because every room of his house had lumber in it. Literally, every room of his house had lumber in it. His garage had lumber in it. Like, it was a lot of lumber, and a lot of vintage hand tools too. I haven't heard from him recently. I don't remember what his name was. Anyways,
Hopefully the lumber didn't fall on him when he was sleeping.
hopefully not. So,
Yeah.
Robert Delk, that was his name, Robert. So, he had a lot of really nice tools too. He didn't like to sell them; he liked to collect them. But no, I guess keep the rain off of it. Let it still get airflow. Like, the worst thing you can do with lumber is drying lumber or dried lumber is envelop it with something. So like wrapping a tarp and tucking it underneath like a, nicely made bed is not a good idea. You need to let air flow through it.
Yeah.
And I found I had this issue here where I'm at now. I didn't have it in my old house, but I have it here because we're by the timber. As soon as you start stacking lumber, you're going to get mice in it. So, like, you'll be pulling apart boards and there's, mice crap and nests and stuff in there. So, and frogs.
Right.
Those are fun. So. But yeah, I don't have any problems storing it outside if I can keep it out of the weather.
Yeah.
And out of direct sunlight, because direct sunlight will fade a lot of stuff too.
Sure. So if you were to keep it outside and use a tarp, instead of putting the tarp on like a bed sheet, you'd set it up almost like a lean-to tent or something like that.
Exactly.
So that it's shading and shedding water.
Yep. Best case scenario, I throw 2x4s on top. So if my stack's 4 foot wide,
Okay.
I'll cut 2x4s that are 6.5 or 7 foot wide and lay them crosswise. So it almost creates like eaves on it.
Sure.
And you can still wrap the tarp a little bit around those to kind of protect some of that side splashing, but you're trying to still allow airflow through the entire top stack or top part of the stack, even if that lumber is dried. You still want air to move. So
Sure.
yeah. Yep.
Because you're trying to avoid creating, you want the climate around each individual board to be as uniform as possible, where you're not creating a wet pocket or a hot space or whatever.
Exactly. And some of the people tend to get more concerned about the wetness rotting their boards away. So like, if my boards get wet, they're going to rot. That's not necessarily the case. Most lumber can get wet and dry multiple times. The problem arises when you have a stack of lumber stickered, it gets wet, and then it can't dry. That's where you get into problems, because generally what you end up with is sticker stain. So you'll get moisture trapped in between your stickers and your boards, and that will cause black mold and mildew, and it will transmit through the board. And a lot of times it will just leave. I don't have anything here that has it, because I'm usually pretty good with my stacks of lumber. But you'll get like shadow lines almost through a board. Yeah. And that's sticker stain. It's mildew causing some form of discoloration of the board. So that's where I guess more of the issue arises. So what are your guys' thoughts on like the plywood like rollout things? Like I've seen where guys will hinge them against their wall.
They swing out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that works under like lumber, like if you have lumber storage above it, but it's like, I don't know. Then it just seems like you always have that, have to have that room to swing it out. So you have to move everything that, all the tools and stuff. And I don't know. It seems like it fill up the garage and it's just hard to have room to swing stuff out.
Yeah, I think there's those kind of situation, that kind of solution is pretty specific in the sense that you would have it alongside a large garage door. So you can't have anything sticking out where, you'd open up the garage door and you still need to get a car in or whatever. And then you could have it pivoting basically almost right next to the garage door. And then you can swing that. And then you have probably more opportunity to have built-in free space to a certain extent to be able to get at it. But it's like that's where that type of storage system works well. So John, you have done tips for Woodsmith for a long time, and storage ideas come in. Have you seen anything that was particularly innovative to you?
Trying to think, because we usually try not to do anything that hangs from rafters because we don't have rafters here, so we'd have to create a ceiling to photograph it, which is a pain in the butt. So
right,
I'm trying to think, because it was like what Logan was saying is like there's always somebody trying to like hoist something up and suspend something, and it's like how practical is that really?
Yeah.
So, or like the swing out method that we were just talking about. So plywood's always just a conundrum because it takes up. Usually you're trying to use wall space for tools or storage, and it takes up wall space, it seems like, no matter what you do. It's in the way. It's either behind something where you can't get to it or in front of something where you can't get to the other stuff you need. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, what about...
I do Logan's method and just bring it here. Store it at the shop.
Yeah, that's right.
If I have
if it gets used, so be it. It's your penance for...
Yep.
It's your penance for using the shop. I mean, I don't necessarily hate the ceiling idea. I'm thinking like in a garage shop. Okay, that doesn't work because you got a garage door opener. Never mind. There's a center mounted. Like I have a double garage door in my garage, and that's a lot of real estate above the garage door. And I don't hate that idea of hanging it like up there because you don't use that space anyways, right? Like some people put racks for like tubs and whatever above their garage door, and that's cool. But if it was a shop, I don't hate that idea of like storing it above the garage door. But I think you'd almost have to do like a winch system. You know what I mean? Where it's like you can use a to lift it up and down, and then it's like, is it really worth it? I mean, yeah. Or do you just buy smaller pieces of plywood if you don't need a full sheet? Or I don't know. I struggle with it because I put a lot of. And again, I'm not going to spin my camera around because you wouldn't know what I'm going to say is true looking at my shop right now. I put a lot of weight on not having a ton of crap floating around. So it's like if I need half a sheet of plywood, I would rather buy a half a sheet of plywood and pay 20% more than buying a whole sheet and having to store a half sheet.
Right.
It's like terrible. I'm sure like Dave Ramsey or whoever the financial person is like screaming at me. But I mean, I put that value on my sanity. Like I can't stand it. So I would rather just pay the little extra and not do that. So.
Well, it was like what Phil was saying earlier. Do you get a storage unit? But then it's like you're paying for that lumber twice over time
and over and over.
And I think the thing about hanging onto scrap pieces of lumber, it's like you're thinking, oh, it's free material later. I've already paid for it. You know, if I throw it away, I lose that. If I hang on to it, it's free. But it's like you get to the point where you're either paying to store it or it's taking up space and you're moving it every time you're trying to get something done. Or so it's like how much cost is in it every time you've touched that to move it, or you're tripping over it, and it's just a big inconvenience. So then it's like you're just paying for it later. If you have, it's okay to keep a small amount that's out of the way, but then it gets to the point where it's costing you either, like you say, your sanity, or costing you to store it, or whatever. So, but.
Now I do like to hold on to special pieces of wood, and this is the Turner in me, is what it is. Mm-hmm. Because like I don't need, the type of, like, I keep saying special, the type of special pieces we find in Iowa aren't like terribly crazy. I mean, we're not getting like big leaf maple burl and stuff like you get in the Pacific Northwest, or like mesquite root balls from down south. We get more of like occasional curly maple. The tree we took down at your house, Phil, had some really nice curl in the trunk flare. Those are the smaller pieces I'll hold on to. I got a shelf above my lathe that has a bunch of little turning blocks on it that I've cut out of some curly maple. I have grabbed a couple special pieces when I went down to David Mark's place. I brought him some English boxwood, and he sent me back with some maple burl, some olive wood. He sent me with a couple of African blackwood clarinet bell blanks, and a pepperwood burl. So like, there are those occasional special pieces that, I'm realizing as I get older, I need to write down stuff on the wood, like where it's from, because it's like I won't remember. I'll remember these, but at some point I'm probably not going to. And my goal is to use them before I forget. But there are little special things, mm-hmm. Or. Oh man, it was when we were in the old video studio. I saved a bunch of redwood from this redwood came from a school in town. They were little shorts, but I still have a bunch of it sitting here. Not a bunch. I have short pieces now, real short pieces. That's almost like it's not almost worth not keeping, but I like the looks of it so much that I keep it. Mm-hmm. So there's always exceptions to the rule.
Yeah. I think it works to hang on to special pieces for turning, because usually turning projects are kind of like a one-off, like one-piece type of thing, where if you're saving stuff to use part of a larger project or larger assembly, it just doesn't seem to match. If you're trying to match it with new wood and old wood, it just the look changes. And so it works for smaller projects and turning, like you said, but if you're hanging on to it thinking you're going to build some cabinet later and buy some new lumber to go with it, it usually doesn't look right.
Yeah. I guess that's what I've found too, is that it's really easy to find like a single board of something and you think it's a great deal, or somebody gave it to you or whatever, but that doesn't mean you need to accept it, because what are you going to do with a single board unless you're making a small box or it's getting turned into a cutting board or something like that?
See, now, is that something you guys would have thought about before being at the magazine? Like, because I don't I know that, yes, if you can select boards from the same tree because you're going to get the most homogeneous color, I get that, and I know I read that, but is it something you guys really would have thought about before being at the magazine? Or would you have been like, hey, I have an extra piece of walnut here, extra piece of walnut from another project, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, I got enough walnut to make a bookcase. And you put it together, you're like, oh, I got a rainbow full of walnut here.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think I would have thought of it in the same way. Sure. Most of the woodworking that I did before I started here, the places where I purchased lumber from let you pick through the stacks. So even if the pieces didn't come from the same tree, you can set boards next to each other and see how they look. You're like, no, this is going to be the tabletop. So if I use these 4 boards, they look okay. Yeah. In that sense, but
yeah, and definitely before I worked here and trying to build projects for the magazine, I just get a board and start cutting it up and use every piece of it. And now I look at it, it's like, well, I'm going to have to throw half of this board away. And I know that, and that's okay. I'm trying to get the best look at the end rather than trying to use every piece of wood for this project, or use some of this, the grain that I don't like as much for the back pieces, or, hide that,
right.
Kind of work around it that way. But yeah,
which is
definitely
funny.
Considering waste and stuff in it.
Say it's funny because the board, the grain you don't like, John, is always the grain I like.
It's like, I'm going to throw all this weird grain out. And you're like, what are you doing? That's like beautiful stuff.
I was just thinking of like the workbench we built on a TV show. Like we had this awesome piece of beach, and John's like, we're putting that on the back because it was all like weird flecked with mineral streaks. And I'm like, that's awesome. John's like, it's going on the back.
I think the problem with that was like all the rest of the pieces looked homogenous, and it was just that one piece. Like if you're going to go, all out and kind of feature some of that stuff, that's fine. But it always looks weird if it's just one piece and it just sticks out like it doesn't belong. So I don't know. For the TV show, I thought it was distracting, but I don't know. I kind of like that more rustic look on stuff, but
characterized look.
Yeah.
So Phil, I've seen your lumber rack in your shop. Do you is most of the stuff in your shop lumber rack stuff that you know what it is? Or do you have some weird stuff in there that you're like, I don't really know what this is?
Most of it I know what it is,
okay.
yeah. And I guess this is why I choose topics like this for the podcast, because I feel schizophrenic sometimes on kind of wishing that I had the opportunity to have some kind of a wood stash. Yeah. So that if I came across a really great deal on, some really cool white pine or something like that, that nice and clear, fun to work with, but I don't really have a use for it right now, then I could draw from that account for a while and not be, I need white pine and the only way I'm going to get it is to pay through the nose and whatever the current market value is on it.
Yeah.
However, I've also suffered for a long time with like, here's a 6-foot board of cherry that's 8 inches wide, 3/4 inch thick. Beautiful piece of wood, straight grain for the most part, very few pitch pockets or mineral streaking on it, almost no sapwood. It's a gorgeous board, and by itself is probably a $50 board, But what am I going to do with that?
Yeah. Make cutting boards, Phil.
Right. And I've done that.
I know.
But it's like there's only so many cutting boards that I can give to people where it's like, I have 12 of your cutting boards already.
Yep.
And unless I light some of these on fire, I don't really need another one.
Yep. It's funny because I think I keep bringing up David Marks because he had the most unbelievable lumber stash I've ever seen. So this is why I'm like, this is funny because I'm drawing on a lot of stuff that I noticed he did with his lumber stashes. I mean, the guy had like full logs of Gabbana ebony sitting there. Like, who does that? Like, I don't get it. However, what I noticed he did is he writes a lot of he'll write on the end grain. So a lot of his short stuff he'll have poked in, so end grain's facing out. But he'll write on it, and the ones that I, after just hanging out with David for a week, I just hear him say it in his head, curly maple, killer figure, and it just like you'll have all these end grain boards that say killer figure, killer, killer, killer. It's like, well, you have a lot of really nice curly maple, but then he's like, oh, you want to go see my real lumber stash? And it's like a separate building where there's slabs of everything just stood up and like pieces of, I don't know, quilted mahogany that he spent, $200 a board foot on. Like, just like nuts stuff.
Yeah.
But Now, we're talking about this, and it sounds all fine and dandy, but there gets to a point where, and David said this, he's like, I will never use all of this in my lifetime. He's like, if I started today and I worked until the day I died, I'm David 70, if I worked from now until the day I died, I would still not get through all my lumber. So he's started to kind of not thin stuff out, but kind of started to let some stuff go that he's like, I would have never thought I would let this go. Yeah. Which is interesting to me.
And that's part of my struggle too, is I'm not 70, but I also don't want to be that old guy where the grandkids have to go through grandpa's barn and shop and deal with, 900 rando boards that he collected because it was a great idea, but he was never going to get to it no matter how long he lived.
Yeah.
That there's just a collector, magpie sort of personality that just needs to have stuff.
Yeah. I think some of it just ends up being, being realistic with what are your goals in your shop? What do you want to build? What do you like building? Just build what you like to build. Like, if you don't like doing cutting boards, throw them freaking scraps away and don't do cutting boards.
Yeah. Or, find somebody who has a wood stove and...
Yeah. Yeah, because, as much as I'm like, well, if I don't cut this log up, it's going to turn into firewood. Well, firewood's a legitimate use.
Maybe that's okay.
Yeah.
All right, I think that wraps up another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or smart remarks, I want to hear about them. You can send them to me by email, woodsmith@woodsmith.com, or you can leave them in the comments section on our YouTube channel, where you can also watch the video recording of the podcast. Otherwise, I would love it if you could rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it to help it get out to more folk like you and extend our reach here a little bit. Otherwise, we'll see you next week, everybody, on the ShopNotes Podcast. Bye.